This question belongs to computer organization and architecture and from the topic IO handling, and it has been asked in the year K 1987. So the question states that data transfer between a microprocessor, which is basically a CPU only, and an IO device is usually faster in memory mapped IO scheme than in IO mapped IO scheme. So suppose whenever our CPU or the microprocessor wants to communicate with the IO device or with the memory, then there are basically three schemes, but the question states about these two schemes only. First one we can say it to be isolated IO or IO mapped IO scheme, and the second one is memory mapped IO scheme. So as we know that all the communication happens through address bus, data bus and the control bus. So in the isolated IO scheme, what happens is that we will have a common address bus for both memory as well as the IO devices, and the control signals would be separate for both. So like suppose CPU wants to read something from memory. So it will give the address in the address bus, and it will then set these control lines to be true and these to be false, so that it can read from the memory. And if it wants to read or write into the IO devices, then it will set these bits to be 1 and these control signals to be 0. So here, as we can use the entire memory space, so we can say that the isolated IO or IO mapped IO or port mapped IO has different address spaces for both IO devices as well as the memory. Now let us consider this memory mapped IO scheme. In this IO scheme, we will have a common address bus, data bus and control bus for both this memory as well as the IO devices. So here what we will do is that we will have to divide the memory into two parts, as we are using the same address, data and control bus. So we need to make a distinction between the memory and IO. So we will have different address spaces for memory as well as for the IO devices. So the question stated that different data transfer between a microprocessor and IO device is usually faster in memory mapped IO scheme than in IO mapped IO scheme. As we can see in IO mapped IO scheme, we have this separate logic for this IO control lines. So it will be generally slower. And in memory mapped scheme, there is distinction between the various parts of memory, so it is generally faster as it do not have any logic of these control lines. So it's true as the memory mapped IO scheme is faster than the isolated IO scheme.